My name is Shia Rubenstein, and I would like to welcome you to the 4th Annual JCon Real Estate Conference. It's about to get very busy, so be happy that you have the air conditioning to yourself. People are starting to roll in. We have an extremely informative seminar now before the next seminar, which is going to be our keynote. As many of you know, the rent rule regulations have changed in New York for the worse, and there's a lot of talk, speculation, concern. So we've sought out to bring some of the greatest experts in the industry from different perspectives, and I'd like to present them to you this evening. We have David Greenfield, who is the CEO of Med Council and also the former chair of the Land Use Committee at the New York City Council. And I apologize, David, your last name? And David Goldfischer, and we have?
Rob Sedaghatpour.
Rob?
Sedaghatpour. Just Rob from Stratco.
There you go. Rob, like Oprah. In any case, without any further ado, I will give you the panel to discuss this topic. And after this seminar, feel free to stay in this room for the keynote as you have the best seats in the house. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming to the best panel. There were so many panels you could have gone to tonight, but this is certainly, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. I want to thank co-panelists Rob Sedaghatpour and David Goldfischer from Stratco. Stratco is a company that are really experts in all of the details of not just rent regulation, but also many of the other complicated areas of regulatory issues in New York City, and we're going to hear from them and their expertise in just a couple of minutes. I think it's important, when we talk about the issue, a lot of folks this year were caught by surprise, right? Is that fair? Was anybody here surprised by the massive change in rent regulations in New York? You mind raising your hands? Okay, we're all friends. Were you surprised? Come on, you were not surprised? So then why aren't you raising your hand? You're just giving me a thumb. I need a whole hand. Raise your hand if you were surprised by the sweeping rent regulations in New York. I'm putting my hand down. I was not surprised. Let me tell you why I wasn't surprised. I've been doing politics for 20 years. In my spare time, I'm an adjunct law professor at Brooklyn Law School. I teach zoning and land use. I was a chair of the Land Use Committee in New York City. I'm a political pundit. You can catch me on New York One on Tuesday nights, occasionally CNN and Fox News. This is what I do. This did not happen by accident. I want you to understand, and this is really a precursor to what we're discussing tonight, and this is honestly something that most people just aren't going to tell you, which is, this is the new normal. And in fact, I'm going to speak about this later at the keynote session for a few minutes, I actually think it's going to get worse. Yeah, that's right. So this is the new normal. I think it's going to get worse, and I think that you need to educate yourselves, and quite frankly, the fact that there's 30 of you here tonight means that you are ahead of the curve as opposed to everybody else who still is sleeping and is going to be surprised. I'm not telling this to you to depress you. I'm telling this to you to understand that next time this happens, you should not be surprised because you understand where the trend is going. It has to do with the political trends in New York, where in New York, the legislature this past year became Democratic for the first time in decades. Previously, it was the Republican Senate. The New York State government is essentially a copy of the federal government, right? Instead of a president, we have a governor. Instead of the assembly, we have a house. Instead of the house, we have an assembly. We have a senate and a senate. The Republicans control the Senate. They've now been taken over by the Democrats, and the Democrats have a very progressive agenda. It is so progressive that I want you to understand how important and how difficult it is to be a real estate advocate these days for those of you who work in real estate. It used to be, if you were an elected official, you can understand this, you did not want to take money from a criminal. Does that make sense? Someone committed a crime and they went to jail, you probably don't want to take money from them. Is that fair? Fair, right? And if you did, you would end up in the newspaper, and the Post would say, Senator X took money from a criminal. Okay. It used to be that the rules essentially were you couldn't take money from someone who was not an American citizen, right? They're not part of our process. We can't do that anymore. It used to be that if someone did something that was deviant and was in the papers and was embarrassing, then they would say, well, you can't take money from this person as well. There are now elected officials in New York City, many of whom, in fact, have announced they are no longer taking money from those people in the real estate industry. Quite a few. So I'm trying to explain to you sort of the shift that has happened in terms of the new normal, right? So essentially, there's a whole group of elected officials today who will not take a nickel from folks in the real estate industry because they consider the real estate industry to be, as a whole, a bad industry, and therefore will not take money. Many of these folks have been elected to office, and they are absolutely dead set on changing the rules. Now, to be fair, just to be fair, if you're looking at it from their perspective, part of this has to deal with the bad actors problem, right? You all know them. None of you are them, of course. You're all the good guys and gals. But you all know people who came into buildings, and they played tricks, and they pushed things around, and the MCIs and IIs were ludicrous, and the renovations never actually happened, and then people got squeezed out. It happens. The problem is that that's the narrative that has been fed, and that is the frustration that many folks have had. And so everything that we're going to discuss today, I want you to think in the back of your mind, is a reaction to those bad actors, right? Which is that the legislators are reacting to bad actors. And they'll say, well, why do you need to spend so much money on an apartment improvement? You'll say, look, I will tell you, in my current capacity, I run the largest Jewish charity in New York. We have 10 different departments. One of them is housing. We have affordable housing, 100% affordable. People ask me how affordable is affordable. Our average rent is $404 a month. That includes utilities. I think we agree that's affordable. We don't have MCIs and IEIs because we're affordable housing. When someone moves out of one of my units, I have to spend, depending on the unit, after 30 years, between $30,000 and $50,000 to improve the unit. Is that fair? Fair ballpark estimate? Okay. What's the current law that just got changed? A little quiz, pop quiz over here. What do they change the current law to in terms of IAIs? Anybody know? $15,000. That's the max. You're talking about the monthly breakdown, but $15,000. Now, is there anybody who actually thinks $15,000 is the right number? I don't know. But that's a reaction to the fact that people would spend an insane amount of money, and therefore we're deregulating these apartments. So I just want to give you that perspective. I think from a big picture perspective, and then I'm going to turn it over to my two co-hosts, there are really, I would say that there are really, I mean, there's a good 20 or so changes, but I want to just flag for you 10, just big picture, understand why they're important. Rent regulations, for the first time, are now going to be permanent. It used to be they would expire every 4 or 8 years. They're now going to be permanent. This is a big deal. It is more difficult to change things when they are forever, right, than when they're up for renewal every 4 years. So just understand that conceptually, that's a very big shift in terms of the rules and politics of rent regulations. There's a repeal, obviously, in high rent vacancy deregulation and high income deregulation. This is actually very interesting. It's an interesting policy discussion, right? Used to be, up until now, you're making $200,000 a year, you can go to DHCR and say, look, my tenant's making too much money, they should be gone. No more. There essentially are no income limits on affordable housing. I find this fascinating. I'm not really thrilled with this as somebody who actually provides affordable housing. I don't think necessarily you should be making $1 million a year and living in affordable housing, but that's what the legislator did. There are reforms on the use of exceptions for owner use, right? It used to be an owner would come in and say, oh, I have a 10-unit building, I'm going to knock the whole thing down, I'm going to make one big mansion. Not anymore. There are repeals on vacancy bonus and the longevity bonus. Preferential rents are now the new rents. And by the way, I'm just glossing over these because they're going to cover this in much more detail than I am. The MCIs are down to 2%. The IAIs are down to $15,000. Co-op condo conversion reforms, you need 51% of the tenants now in order to agree to purchase the apartments in order for conversion to be effective. Very interesting, people don't actually pay attention to this one, which is that the law now allows other localities outside of New York City to opt into this scheme as well, which is really fascinating that people don't realize as well. And the law has also made a lot of changes in terms of regulatory side. For example, it limits how many security deposits that you can give, and you can no longer use a tenant blacklist. So if you had a bad tenant and you had a list, this is a bad tenant and we own 1,000 units and don't actually rent to these folks, you can no longer do that. Now, once again, you need to just realize this is the new normal. We're going to get into it in a little bit about why this happened and what the details and what the implications are. And the implications are vast. Let's be clear. It's not simply that there's a restructuring in the market and many of you have lost a lot of money in terms of the worth of your apartments. It is also there are going to be a lot of ancillary impacts that people haven't even thought about yet, such as tax revenue, which Rob and David are going to speak about. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rob and David They literally eat and breathe this stuff. I do it from a 30,000-foot level. They're doing it every single day. And in fact, if you have any questions or need any information, you should come to them afterwards. They're awesome consultants, and I'll turn it over to Rob to get us underway. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So we're going to aim to be done by 6:20. We're going to attempt to take questions throughout the presentation. So if we can have the presentation queued. Give a background on ourselves. We're specialists in this space as far as tenant buyout, certificate of non-harassment applications, property management, due diligence, and individual apartment increase documentation and gathering. So we're going to go into big picture on what David elaborated on this. We're going to go through each one of these in detail. We're going to give the political perspective. We're going to give the micro perspective of what happens on the ground and how to adapt to it. So the most recent bill was called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. Last time this came around, it was the Rent Act of 2015, where they raised the IAIs. It was very much focused on tenant harassment, and that's when the buyout letters came into effect. Rent Act of 2011 went from 1/40th to 1/60th on larger buildings. And what you could pick up here, which David is going to elaborate a little bit later, is the number of sponsors on this bill and what their mandate was, why they were for this, and what was the root of it. So David Goldfischer, can you elaborate on the rent growth bills?
Sure. So we have 6 primary rent growth bills here that were recently passed. David just touched on most of them. I'm going to go into a little greater detail here. The first we mentioned end vacancy decontrol. In the past, if we had a unit that crossed the vacancy threshold, which was 2733, that unit would become deregulated. The city put an end to that. The city does not want any more units leaving the rent stabilization program. We have end of the vacancy increase. Again, in the past, we had, if a rent-regulated unit vacated, you would get that automatic 18 to 20% bump. The city did away with that as well. Prohibit pref rent adjustments. In the past, the landlord had their option to remove a pref rent that the tenant was paying when that tenant was up for renewal. Going forward, as long as that same tenant is currently in the apartment, the landlord can only adjust the rent based off the pref. They can't realize that legal rent. Eliminate MCIs. Again, we just mentioned the MCIs are now capped at 2% and they expire after 30 years. Repeal IAI rent increases. This is probably the biggest hit. We went from 1/40th to 1/168th for units with buildings with 35 units or less, and from 1/160th to 1/180th for buildings with 35 units or more. And again, that's capped at $15,000 per unit, and can only conduct these repairs on 3 units over a 15-year period. And again, they expire after 30 years as well. And then lastly, the expansion of 1974 tenant protections. The city now allows any municipality within the state to opt in to the rent stabilization program, provided there is an emergency housing crisis within that region.
So the sunset clause that David Greenfield outlined earlier is that every 5 years these were up for renegotiation within the state government. Because there was so much power within democratically controlled government at this time, they voted to make these permanent. David, do you want to elaborate why this was part of their agenda and what motivated them to basically bring this over the top this year?
So I think, when we talk about permanence, I think what really motivated them is that in the past, the Senate has flipped, right? So just a few years ago, you had a Democratic Senate, and it only lasted for 2 years. So they're asking themselves, and they're saying, well, what happens if there's a revolt, and everybody gets together and decides to elect a Republican Senate? The answer is that right now, there wouldn't be a need. If you think about what essentially would happen is you'd have a split legislature, right? Because you still would have, the Assembly has a supermajority that's Democratic. So the Assembly, everybody agrees, in New York State is going to stay Democratic. The only play that Republicans have in New York State is to try to go back and flip the Senate back to Republican. So now, if the legislation expires every 4 to 8 years, and there are different parts of it, some were 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, then you have to come back and negotiate that legislation. If you think about it, it's kind of brilliant what they did, right? Which is that by making it permanent, you need to have both sides of the legislature agree, which will be highly unlikely, right? Because the Senate is going to perhaps flip back. I don't think that's likely, but it could happen. But the Assembly will stay permanently Democratic, and therefore this locks in their laws for the foreseeable future.
Got it. So let's go into detail on a few of the rent growth bills that basically froze people's rents, and then we'd like the backstory on what basically antagonized or motivated them to put a stop on investing back in our buildings. So the elimination of the vacancy bonus. Dave, what's happening here?
Yeah, so in the past, again, landlords now cannot collect the automatic bump that they would get when a unit vacates. Once a unit vacates, the only increase they could get is the Rent Regulated Board mandatory increase per year.
So one thing we'd like to come back to a little bit further down is a lot of these laws came into effect during the Giuliani era, especially during the 93 and 94 Rent Act at that time, where public policy was for investing back in these buildings. And now, basically a 25-year cycle, all of these are being repealed. So additional vacancy bonuses, this is referring to the longevity increases, those are also eliminated. Vacancy decontrol, David?
Vacancy decontrol, again, once the unit crosses the 2,700 and change threshold, that's irrelevant anymore. One thing to keep in mind is that the city did pass a cleanup bill a few days after the initial bill was passed, where 421A buildings, those units that were deregulated in 421A buildings, those units still remain deregulated and will remain deregulated once the 421A exemption expires.
So you cannot take a unit out of rent regulation, and whatever allowance there was in the past as far as vacancies are also they're also eliminated in full. 421A buildings we discussed, as long as you have the riders in place from beginning to the last lease prior to the expiration, those buildings become permanently free market post tax exemption. Preferential rent. So let's give an example here. Let's say, for example, I'm the tenant, David Goldfischer is the landlord. I move in 2015, I'm paying a rent of $1,800. The market can't support the legal rent of $2,500. In the past, upon expiration and upon the next renewal, David can exercise the next legal rent or a higher rent below the legal rent on my next renewal. So what they were attempting to do here is they wanted to eliminate those business plans of using the pref to legal spread as a negotiating tactic to turn over units. So what they said is, we'll honor you, we'll let you keep your legal rent, but we don't want that being used as a tactic to vacate that tenant, displace that potential family that might be living in there, and cause havoc in that neighborhood. So what they're saying is you can continue getting your increases off of the legal rent. You can charge your current tenant that pref rent, get increases off of that, and if that tenant's bought out, leaves on their own, or is evicted, on that next tenant you can charge the legal rent. So Dave, what's going on here with the rent overcharge liability, and how does it affect free market units?
This is one of the most impactful aspects of the bill. I think that if you read, I'll go through these points, but again, I think after this part of the bill has been passed, there's probably going to be a flood of overcharge claims from tenants. First and foremost, starting from the top, the 4-year look back in the past, there was a 4-year statute of limitations on overcharge claims. The city has now stretched that to 6 years. Number two, the recovery of the actual overcharge is limited to 6 years, and treble damages can now be collected to 6 years as well. That's an increase from 2 years, but the thing to keep in mind is that overcharge claims can be filed at any time. Whether or not the tenant will get damages and treble damages, that has to be within the 6 years, but a tenant can technically file an overcharge at any point in time. In determining the proper rent, the bill is very broad, and they say the most recent reliable registered rent over the past 6 years. Again, it's a very broad statement. It's open to interpretation. So the most recent reliable, I'm not sure how they determine what reliable means, but this is what they said. Number four, unless the court determines by preponderance of the evidence that the overcharge was not willful, the landlord is still going to be responsible for treble damages. In the past, if a tenant filed an overcharge claim and the landlord immediately surrendered, said, I'm sorry, it was a mistake, and repaid the tenant back all the money he overcharged, that was a rebuttal presumption that the mistake was an error, and the court would essentially let it slide. The court is saying now, no, that's not the case anymore. Even if it was clearly a mistake, the landlord admitted to it and repaid the tenant back immediately, he's still going to be liable for treble damages. And then, yeah, that's what I just touched on the last point as well.
So, our other David, what's the backstory? This was such a comprehensive approach to basically limit an owner's ability to basically invest back in their building, get a yield on that, and also outside of that, they're basically clawing back on units that were deregulated. Basically back to '84, there's an opportunity to go back 6 years, get 3 times those 6 years, 9% interest rate, and on top of that, attorney fees. What are they trying to accomplish here, and why?
I think there's a few interesting things that are going on in terms of what it is that the motivation was. The first is, what you have to understand is that most people don't go to Albany. It's 4 hours from Brooklyn. It's a little bit of a hassle to get there. It's not as glamorous as DC. There's no fancy restaurants. So you have to be very motivated to actually go up to Albany and to advocate. You know who's motivated? Tenants are, right? Because they're always afraid, what if an MCI comes along, right? What's going to happen on the future of my units and the affordability of the city? Every single Tuesday, this past legislative session runs from January to June. Every single Tuesday in Albany was a day called Tenant Tuesday. Thousands of tenants were bussed in from across the state, and they would rally and yell and scream and visit legislators, and they would demand and say, oh my God, you need to do something about this. That puts an intense amount of pressure on the people who are already there. And if, as you recall, which we discussed earlier for some of those who weren't here, because the legislative control flipped in the Senate, and the Senate is now Democratic, they are really interested in trying to provide these reforms. For really, I would say, predominantly two major reasons. The first is, if you look at the numbers, and you know this as well, if not better than I would, we have lost tens of thousands of rent-regulated units in New York City. And as you know, once you lose a rent-regulated unit, it's very difficult to create another rent-regulated unit because it's very expensive and unwieldy. So that's the first issue. They're trying to protect the overall market so that there are rent-regulated units. The second issue, and that's what a lot of this other legislation speaks to, is the fact that tenants are frustrated because in many cases, and especially in the abusive cases, right, there was an MCI and someone comes in and says, okay, I'm going to put up cameras. I'm going to put up state-of-the-art cameras, and I'm going to redo the entire backyard. And the tenant says, I didn't really benefit from that, and now I'm paying an extra $100 a month in rent, and that's frustrated them. So a lot of it was either in the worst cases, people were abusing the system, or even in the not worst cases, honestly, there was a lack of communication between the landlords and the tenants, right? So the tenants felt, why are you doing these improvements that I don't want, and now I have to pay for it? And they went literally crying to their elected officials and said, look, I have to pay an extra $1,200 a year in rent for what? For a security camera? For a backyard that's not even finished? That's not fair. That shouldn't happen. And that's the pushback that you got from those thousands of tenants who were up there every single Tuesday.
Got it. So rent-controlled units, so they basically cap those MBRs where you can get allowances if you had a low violation count. What still exists here is that a rent-controlled unit vacates, you can bring that unit to market level and give them rent-stabilized lease as their initial lease, and that unit becomes rent-stabilized. So there still is an opportunity within rent-controlled units to bring those up to market without investment in IAIs. So Part I basically eliminated the opportunity of converting a building to a single-family residence or moving into a building and reclaiming a number of units for your personal benefit. So those basically angles where someone was buying a building for themselves to move into, they covered all those angles of what historically people were using as a method of litigation or litigating against tenants. So they basically covered those angles. And this, in my opinion, this happened basically from perspective of abuse, and there was too much attrition of buildings and units being lost through the system through these tactics that were instituted here. Program tenants. David, can you elaborate on this? David Greenfield. Are you familiar? So basically, in the past, nonprofit units, you were able to not renew those leases and reclaim rent-stabilized units upon lease expiration. They covered that angle. As long as there was a vulnerable tenant within that nonprofit in that apartment, and they gave a qualification of what that is, that tenant can permanently stay in that apartment going forward. This was also another angle of an owner's business plan of vacating these nonprofits.
I mean, just remember, it comes down to these two buckets, right? When you're trying to understand what was the legislative intent over here, why did the legislators try to do this, it really comes down to these two buckets. One is there are overall advocates who are concerned about the cost of living in New York City, and especially folks in terms of the new left, the rise of people like AOC. Everybody here knows who AOC is today. You had no idea who she was a year ago, right? Just shows you the sense of how dramatically politics have changed as well. These folks are saying, I'm I'm coming into New York, or I'm looking to rent a place, or I want to move from a studio to a two-bedroom, I cannot find affordable housing. So on that level, that's what this is all about, which is let's preserve as much affordable housing as we have. The second bucket, and everything that we discussed today will fall into these two buckets, the second bucket really has to deal with, I don't want to see rent increases. And that's where the MCIs and the IIs come in, which is I don't want to see rent increases, because in II you could increase the rent and it still could be rent regulated, obviously, as you know. I just don't want an increase in rent because I, as a tenant, am always worried about that. And that's the two buckets that really motivated the legislature in terms of what they see in all of these rules. And there's dozens of variations, literally, we're only highlighting a dozen or so today. They all come from one of those two places. I want to protect what we have, or I don't want to see a rent increase because I'm a tenant and I'm upset, and that's why I went up to Albany to advocate.
I got it. So one thing I'd like you to address at one point during this presentation is affordability right now in New York City is, the rule of thumb is 25% of your income should go towards housing. In New York City, it's probably about 50%.
Yeah.
Okay, you might say it's 30%.
Yeah.
So it's about 50% or above. Real estate taxes for many owners 15 years ago was probably about 15% of your rent roll. Now in parts of the city, it's north of 30%. So what I'd like you to address, if we can't grow our rent roll and the city's continuing to increase the biggest line item on operating expenses as far as property taxes, where are we going to make up the difference, especially if we can't get a yield on our investment and we can't grow our rents? You want to address this?
Yeah, you know, look, it's a fascinating question. I served for 5 years on the budget negotiating team in the New York City Council. So basically there are 10 of us who are city council members, and our job, as sort of similar to how the legislature negotiates in Albany with the governor, our job was to negotiate with the mayor. Right now we're up to a $95 billion budget, which, just to put it in perspective, roughly a third of which comes from real estate taxes. To put that in perspective, that's the size of a medium European country like Hungary, right? They've got national defense and national health and security. Our New York City budget, forget the state, it's another $150 billion. The New York City budget is close to $95 billion, right? And so my job was to negotiate with the mayor's office on what our priorities were. And we knew on the budget negotiating team that real estate was the major economic driver. If you ask me, how are we able to add so many jobs? Under de Blasio, we've added 300,000 New York City jobs. How did that happen? The answer is because of the real estate. So thank you very much. So the obvious question is, well, what's going to happen? The answer is kind of bizarre, and it's twofold. The first is, you have to remember, as bizarre as what this is, and I'm just telling you frankly, is there is a divide between the state and the city. The state regulates the city. And the state made these rules. The state does not necessarily care where the city is going to get their tax money from. I know that seems wacky to you, but that's just the way it works. In fact, if you follow this, you'll notice sometimes it gets a little bit competitive. The governor and the mayor, even though they're from the same state and city, don't always get along, right? So I'm not going to tell you this was necessarily very well thought out or strategic in terms of the financing. That's the first thing. The second thing you have to understand, and once again, just to be very transparent, you're beginning to hear a lot right now about things like a millionaire's tax. And why are people discussing a millionaire's tax? And when they're discussing a millionaire's tax, to be blunt, they're not just talking about people who actually make $1 million. They're talking about 200, 250, right? Those are the numbers. And the reason is that there are some smart people who recognize that in the next few years, inevitably, because the values of real estate have gone down, that the real estate receipts for taxes will have to decline, and if not, you're going to legally challenge them, and therefore, they recognize that you're going to have to get a new revenue stream, and that is going to be a tax on people who are what they call millionaires, even though, to be blunt, they're not going to be millionaires.
Moving forward, so you're going to have a better time buying treasury bills than putting MCIs back in your buildings. When we're talking about MCIs, the legwork involved with basically doing those CapEx and the yield you're going to be getting, you're better off basically putting it back in the market. This is rolling back to MCIs effective as of June 2012, and they're also not permanent, so they expire after 30 years. IAIs, very quickly, instead of being 1/40th and 1/60th, it's now 1/168, and larger buildings 1/180, capped at 15,000, and it basically comes out to a $90 increase per apartment on the dollars that you spent. So what happens if how many people were in the midst of renovations when this all came about? Anyone? So what happens to those units? David Goldfischer, can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So the city, again, passed the cleanup bill a few days after the initial bill was released, and they inserted this, pretty ambiguous language here. It says beginning with the first individual apartment improvement on or after June 14th, 2019. So the question is here, what does the first individual apartment improvement mean? Does that mean the first time you start your repairs? Does it mean when you continue the repairs that were in middle of, that were ongoing? What we've seen with a lot of our clients is that they're taking the approach that any repairs which were in the midst of ongoing during, on June 14th, 2019, those are grandfathered into the old program, the 140th or the 160th. But going forward, if you have a unit that was vacant and you hadn't yet started the construction, you're stuck and you're gonna have to abide by the new laws, either 1/168 or the 1/180th.
Mr. Greenfield, wouldn't it be reasonable to give a sunset, to basically give 3 months for owners to wind down their renovations on their current investments? Why wasn't there some basically middle approach? Why was it such a hard line with no mercy?
So, it's an excellent question. There's 3 points I want to make. First of all, right, I'm no longer a legislator, so I'm a political expert. I'm just explaining it, so please don't shoot the messenger, because I see I'm getting some glaring eyes as I'm just explaining the thinking behind. I'm just sort of pulling the curtain behind so you understand what happened. The second thing I just want to point out is that there was a concern, legitimate or not, but there was a concern that if you had a 3 or 6 month period, there would be a rush, right? Which is that suddenly people would rush to try to do these IAIs, and therefore you'd lose, consequently, apartments because of that. But there's a third and final point, which honestly you won't read about in the newspapers, and as somebody who, I was up in Albany between January and June approximately 6 times, including when the session ended. I was there for 48 hours straight because I have some legislative priorities that we were working on and met council on behalf of the poor and the Jewish community. And I'll tell you something really fascinating, which people don't realize, is that the reason this passed, which is honestly, anyone objectively will tell you this is the most extreme version of the proposals, right? I think you would agree. I think anybody who even follow this would say, well, we thought it was going to be a little bit better, somewhat better. So the obvious question is, so what happened? And it's really fascinating, and this is the behind-the-scenes approach. It's just worth understanding, and that is that the governor of the state of New York actually was sympathetic to the real estate owners. Traditionally, he has a very good relationship with the real estate community. Generally, he does. The governor, however, is also a very aggressive negotiator. I don't know if you know him, but he's just a very aggressive negotiator, athlete, competitor. This is who he is. The governor did something that was very, very risky. And in the past, it's worked for him. Unfortunately, this time it didn't, which was he played a game of chicken. Classic game of chicken. 2 cars driving along until somebody swerves away. Here's what happened. The state Senate, which is a lot more progressive than any of the other bodies, they said, we want to pass these radical bills to reform housing in New York State. Now, the governor could have said, look, that's not fair, that's not reasonable, let's all sit down at the table and let's negotiate, but that's not the way he negotiates. So what the governor did instead was he said, really? If you could pass these bills, go pass the bills. Go, get the votes. And you know what? I'll tell you, just to show you that I'm a fair guy, if you pass these bills, whatever you pass, I'm going to sign. Now, the package of bills that were proposed, they really couldn't pass 100% of it, but what they realized was they could pass 95% of it. So there was no negotiation that went on with the governor. So they went to the New York State Assembly, and they told the Assembly, look, what do you object to? And they said, really, we have a problem with one bill, which we'll talk about later, which is the good cause bill, which essentially would be universal rent control. And we'll talk about it during the next session. And the Assembly said, if you get rid of that, we're probably okay with the rest of the bill. And so they said, great. So the Senate passed it, the Assembly passed it, and they said, hey, Mr. Governor, congratulations, you're going to sign it? And he's like, yeah, I guess I will. And that's what happened. He played chicken, and honestly, he lost. And that's why you're seeing the most extreme version. It may not be rational, but ladies and gentlemen, this is what we call politics.
Let's keep going. So IAIs we discussed. So is the event organizer at 6:20? How much time are we working with? 4 minutes. Okay, so we're going to actually, David, let's go to the end. So actually on condo conversions, they're requiring a collaborative approach here. So initially you needed 15% to get a condo conversion approved. They switched the numbers. Instead of 1.5, now it's 5.1. Harvey Epstein, who's the initiator of this bill, he thought it would be a good idea, since he owns an HDFC condo unit, that all of New York State should benefit from what he experienced many years ago, and owners should be required to collaborate with their tenants in order to encourage them to become homeowners. What's not clear to us is how are they going to execute this plan with a mayor that's looking for another job, who is the CEO of the city, 14 of the major department heads are vacant, including all the housing positions. In addition to that, spending is going at an astronomical pace, and the biggest component of the city budget is real estate taxes. With rent rolls not growing, taxes aren't going to grow. And if transactions aren't going to happen, you're not going to be able to reassess these buildings. How is this repositioning strategy for New York City going to be effective if all of these components are missing?
You know, I'll leave you with a final antidote. When I was chair of the Land Use Committee, which was 18 months ago, and my job was to decide on rezonings in New York City, I met with every major real estate developer in New York. So Related, SL Green, you name them, they all came to my office to pitch me on proposals. They wanted to create a new village, or they wanted to build a skyscraper. And they all used to ask me a very similar variation of a question, which is exactly your question, which is, logically, if you think about it, don't you want big buildings in New York City? Don't you want more development in New York City? Don't you want more taxes in New York City? Don't you want more jobs in New York City? And I always just sit there and I always just say, look, the problem honestly is that you're very good at what you do, which is as a real estate professional, but the real estate folks don't understand the political world, which is the political world is not based on logic. It is based on strategy. And they're trying to appeal to certain constituencies. So all of the questions that you ask are all valid questions, but the answer is it doesn't matter to them. What really matters to them is a question of what is most strategic to achieve a very specific certain goal. And in this case, by the way, the last slide that you had from the 15 to 51, you know why that was done? To be perfectly blunt, I'll tell you why. I spoke to the legislators. I said, what was the thinking? They said, because when we spoke, this was what I call the Iber Chacham clause, or for those of you who don't speak Yiddish, the wise guy clause. This is what the legislators told me. I was up there in June and I said, I'm a little bit curious. This wasn't even on the radar screen. Did you even hear about this? No. Why did you guys pass this change from 15% to 51%? I said, we'll tell you why. We met with developers, and you know what the developers told us? Okay, if you make all these rent reforms, you know what we're going to do? We're going to convert the buildings. All we need is 15%. And then, boom, light bulb went off in our head and said, hey, we don't want that to happen, so you know what we're going to do? We're going to change it from 15% to 51%. And that's just a real-life example of what happens. The short answer is that it's not logic, it's strategy and it's results, and if it gets messed up, which it will, and if you don't believe me, by the way, I was the one who introduced legislation in the City Council to regulate Uber and Lyft, and I said 5 years ago when I introduced legislation that if we do not do this, if we don't regulate them and treat them the same way we treat yellow cabs, we're going to put yellow cabs out of business. And people said, nah, who cares? Doesn't matter. Uber's an important company. We don't want to fight with them. Anybody know what happened to the yellow cab industry? They went out of business. And right now, everybody's talking about how we're going to fix it. The answer is they'll come back later and they'll figure out how to pick up the pieces.
So based off of this current formula, wouldn't you project that New York City may financially go without saying the B word?
Well, no, I don't think that's going to happen. I'll tell you why. First of all, there's a lag, right? The assessments, anyone who does the assessments knows there's a lag. It takes time. You're talking about a couple of years between it gets assessed and then when you actually pay your assessment and then challenge your assessment. So you're talking about at least 18 months until you're actually going to see the impact. That's the first thing. The second thing, and this is what I project, I'm being very honest, which is I think they're going to look for other sources of income. And that's why I go back to my original point. I think you're going to start hearing more talk about a millionaire's tax. And it's not just going to be for millionaires. It's going to be for people who are high earners, the top 10%, anyone who makes more than $200,000 a year, which many in our community would consider to be middle class or upper middle class. I think that's what you're going to see. And I think that they're going to look for other revenue, and that's what government does. They're always going to look for another way to solve the problem.
How does the mayor looking for another job impact the ability to execute
Look,
all
I
of
think
these
what
regulations?
ends up happening is the Democratic primary. Anybody here watch the Democratic debates over the last few weeks? Yes? No? Maybe? I did. In any event, if you watch the debates, you'll actually see the party as a whole has shifted very far left, right? And so if you're running for president right now, you need to be responsive to the interests of the party. And I think that you're going to see more of these rules and regulations that are going to be coming out that are going to be perceived as very tenant-friendly, because if you have a mayor who's running for president, he wants to be able to point to saying, look, here's what I've done in my city. So it comes back to my original point. I think the environment for landlords, quite frankly, is going to be a little bit more challenging.
Got it.
Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just here to explain what's going on.
Are there any challenges in the courts?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I'll conclude with that, and then I'll let these guys wrap up. So people always ask, are there any challenges in the courts? And the answer is yes. So let's just assume, in the best of cases, a court challenge is 50-50 successful, right? Is that fair? In the best case scenario, when you challenge a case like this one, there's an unsettled area of law, it's a coin toss, right? You never really know. It's not like a simple situation like, you stole something from me and I want it back. These are very complicated areas of New York State Constitution, federal Constitution, takings issues, and there's a lot of case law on this, which I'm a law professor, so I can spend you an hour, but just trust me when I'll tell you it's a toss-up. But here's what people don't realize. Traditionally, when laws are passed that relate to policy, what happens is the legislature will come back and simply create a legislative fix to that law. So even if you're successful, in general, it's going to take on average 5 years to turn over a law. Even if you're successful, all that's really going to happen is it just buys you more time, right? The legislature will come back and simply try to tweak the law again for whatever standard, in this case, probably the Supreme Court. If they took it, the Supreme Court says, well, this law violates XYZ clause because of ABC. They'll say, okay, well, now we're going to rely on the QRS clause based on WXY, right? So you just have to remember, when it comes to policy, it's a cat and mouse game, and just keep that in mind as you think about it. Everybody thinks it's a solution. It's not like you sue me and I sue you and the court says the property is mine and it's over. It doesn't work that way. When it comes to policy, if the courts overturn it, 99 out of 100 times, the legislature, if they're still believing that, they'll come back and they'll try to tweak it all over again. Doesn't work that way. Why don't they do this with food and clothing? They do, by the way. It's funny. I had lunch with a real estate developer today, and he was asking me the same question. He said, this is outrageous. How can the government regulate the price of the thing? I said, cigarettes, right? I mean, this isn't a new concept. We regulate the prices of all sorts of things, right? Cigarettes. Go buy a pack of cigarettes in New York City. It's $15 a pack. Go to duty-free on your way to Israel. It's $4 a pack. Well, where's that $11 from? The city has artificially created a law and said we want to have a certain price. And so the answer is that they could. I'm not saying they will or they won't, but they could. The purpose of this seminar is not to debate the merits. It's not that it's us versus you. It's really to try to provide you with an insider glimpse. And if we have, then hopefully we were successful, which is to take the curtain away and to say, look, these are the experts on what the actual impact is, and we're the experts in terms of why it happened, just so you have an understanding of where it's going and where it's trending. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at the next program. With that, I'll turn it over to the two experts. I thank you all for indulging me. I'll see you in a little bit.
So I believe we're out of time. Can we get a confirmation? So we wanted to thank everyone for coming, and outside of this, we can answer any questions privately.